The New York Times and the Jews. The hate never stopped. Did a 1922 article advise not to worry about Hitler's anti-Semitism? An early New York Times report about Adolf Hitler woefully misjudged the virulence of his anti-Semitism. A 1922 New York Times article reported that Adolf Hitler was merely using anti-Semitic propaganda as a bait to catch masses of followers. But several reliable, well-informed sources confirmed the idea that Hitler's anti-Semitism was not so genuine or violent as it sounded, and that he was merely using anti-Semitic propaganda as a bait to catch masses of followers and keep them aroused, enthusiastic, and in line for the time when his organization is perfected and sufficiently powerful to be employed effectively for political purposes. A sophisticated politician credited Hitler with peculiar political cleverness for laying emphasis and overemphasis on anti-Semitism, saying, "You can't expect the masses to understand or appreciate your finer real aims. You must feed the masses with cruder morsels and ideas like anti-Semitism. It would be politically all wrong to tell them the truth about where you really are leading them." Placement of news articles. The placement of news articles in a newspaper is a good indication of the importance given by the newspaper to a story. The Times consistently placed major stories about the Nazi treatment of European Jews on back pages by the soap and shoe polish ads. 1. Left found that during the period September 1939 to May 1945, very few stories about Jewish victims made the Times front page. The story of the Holocaust, meaning articles that focused on the discrimination, deportation, and destruction of the Jews, made the Times front page just 26 times, and only in 6 of those stories were Jews identified on the front as the primary victims. Terminology. Left points out that the Times often used a more generic term such as refugee or nationality to refer to Nazi victims who were Jewish. In his review, Gal Beckerman writes, "More shocking even than the chronic burying of articles with the word Jew in them is how often that word was rubbed out of articles that specifically dealt with the Jewish condition. It's almost surreal at times. How could you possibly tell the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising without mentioning Jews?" But the Times did, describing how 500,000 persons were herded into less than 7% of Warsaw's buildings, and how 400,000 persons were deported to their deaths at Treblinka. As Left put it, the Times, when it ran front-page stories, described refugees seeking shelter, Frenchmen facing confiscation, or civilians dying in German camps, without making clear the refugees, Frenchmen, and civilians were mostly Jews. Role of religion. Sulzberger was a convinced Reform Jew, which was the basis of his assimilationist approach. Judaism for him was only a religion, and that Jews were neither a race nor a people any more than Presbyterians or Methodists were a race. In December 1942, in a memo to New York Times staff, he wrote, "I have been trying to instruct the people around here on the subject of the word Jews, i.e., that they are neither a race nor a people, etc." 3. Former New York Times journalist Ari Goldman, in his review of the book, writes, "There can be little doubt that Sulzberger's views about Judaism trickled down to the editors making the decisions about what to put in the newspaper every day." Staff biases. Leff examines the stances and performances of the Times's reporting and editorial staff. In the field, she exposes the disturbing Nazi and Vichy attachments of a few European correspondents. 3. While back in New York, Sulzberger's bias was shared by other Jewish staffers, between them and influential Catholics among the crucial night editors, who decided where to place news items. The imperiled Jews of Europe had no advocate in the newsroom. Conclusion. Blame for the lack of coverage, beside the biases and lack of competence of the European correspondents, Leff points out the problems with journalistic convention of the time, which preferred reprinting government pronouncements to digging for unknown stories. There was also, of course, a disorganized Jewish community and a Roosevelt administration too preoccupied with the war, both not pushing hard enough for front-page coverage. But the bulk of the blame, in Leff's telling, falls squarely at the feet of the Times's publisher, Sulzberger. 3. A number of observers have observed how badly informed the American public was about the Nazis' systematic murder of European Jews. 5, 6, 7. Left points out that the way the Times covered the Holocaust contributed to the public's ignorance. But in addition to poorly informing the public, the Times coverage mattered so much, she writes, because other bystanders, particularly the American government, American Jewish groups, and the rest of the American press, took cues from the paper. Among major American newspapers, it was unique in the information it received, how it disseminated the news, and to whom. Adolf Hitler, Man of the Year, 1938. Time. New York Times reports was one of the main reasons the United States sent a shipload of fleeing Jews back to Nazi Germany to die.
When they reached Havana, their luck ran out. The Cuban government refused their admission, and for the next week, the frantic passengers vainly sought a port that would allow them entry. Every country in South America refused. The United States response was even more strict. It sent a gunboat to shadow the St. Louis in case it got close enough to allow the passengers to slip ashore and swim to safety. Only Canada remained. A desperate plea to Ottawa for permission to land was promptly rejected. As a top official of the immigration branch explained to the Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, no country can open its doors wide enough to take in the hundreds of thousands of Jews who wish to leave Europe. The line must be drawn somewhere. The line drawn, the passengers' last flickering hope for rescue extinguished. The Jews on the St. Louis were forced back to Europe, where many were killed in the death camps of the Third Reich.
The New York Times has never stopped its hatred of Jews, and especially the State of Israel. This is why they don't call Hamas terrorists. They always believe Hamas and lie on their behalf. And they believe in the old saying, how is it that a Jew dares to defend himself and fight back?